Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. I'm Anna. I know that I have a lot of explaining to do by way of where I've been and sort of why I've abandoned this channel. The only explanation I can give is that life has been very busy. And I know that's very cliche and not really an excuse, but that is honestly the truth. I've been doing so much in the summer after April. Once I finished those 4 videos, I literally went right into summer, was taking summer classes, was working, and so there was not a lot of time for me personally or for anything outside of school or work. And then I got back to college and it was kind of the same thing. I was taking more classes than usual and the time just sort of got away from me. And so I wasn't able to maintain the schedule of making videos as often as I would like. However, I did read poetry, so hopefully within this holiday season, I'll be able to get in some of the books that I've read that I really want to share with you guys. And hopefully the new year will be a new page and I can be able to maintain a more frequent schedule with making videos. But for those of you who have stuck with my channel, who have subscribed, who have commented on my videos, followed me on Instagram, I just want to say thank you so much. That means a lot to me and I really appreciate your support, and I'm going to try my best to continue to put out reviews for you guys so that you guys can share in sort of the poetry world that I've been in even when I'm offline. That is actually a great segue into the topic for today's video, which is a book review on a really great poetry book that I think you guys will like. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So the book that I'm going to be reviewing today is Knock Out Monarch by Crystal Stone. This book is really special because Crystal actually contacted me a couple months ago asking if I would read her work and give her a review, and I was happy to do so, delighted to do so, and I was also very delighted by her poetry. Her poems are very deep, very complex, beautiful imagery, beautiful word choice. I was able to ask her some questions about her work, which is something that I've never been able to do for a poet before, and she was gracious enough to reply to me answering those questions, and so I really want to thank her for that. That was really special to me, and I really appreciate the time that she took to answer my questions. The book, as I said, is called Knock Off Monarch. It is composed of 6 parts. They're not titled, they're just in numerals. However, there is artwork at the beginning of each section, sort of going over the life cycle of a butterfly. So I'm not so much going to go into each section as I am going to kind of break down the different themes and methods of writing that she uses and the way that she expresses herself, that in a way that I think is a little bit more unique than maybe the other poets that I have reviewed on this channel. Another nice thing about this is that there's a table of contents, which is not something that you find very often in poetry books, but there's a table of contents sort of detailing where everything is. If you have a favorite poem, then you can definitely highlight it and remember where it is, which I really liked. As you know, I like to mark up my books. I like to see the evidence that I've read it. I really love doing that. I think the more colorful ones, I go back and I'm like, oh, those are the ones that I want to go back over and read. The great thing about Crystal's writing is that you can read it multiple times and you'll always find a new meaning. I read this twice and I enjoyed it the second time around a lot differently than I enjoyed it the first time around. Knowing what's coming is definitely an aid in helping you understand her work. So I would definitely recommend that you don't just read it once and put it down. I do think that her work gets better over time as you read it more. It becomes more meaningful. So let's get into some of the themes that she uses in her work. One thing that I noticed in her book is that she plays around a lot with white space. And that's a really interesting thing for poets to do. I want to show you an example. So there's a poem she has called Strawberries, in which she creates the poem in the shape of a strawberry. And that's an incredible thing to read. It's incredible as you're reading it to be like, wow, she had to pick words or a form that would put the words in the shape of a strawberry and yet still have meaning in that and it brings meaning into the words themselves, and it also just gives this overall kind of vibe for the poem. And she does that multiple times with different poems. She plays around a lot with enjambment, which is a word I learned in my poetry class, which kind of means just where you break lines. She plays around a lot with that, and where she chooses to break lines, which is interesting because it can give lines multiple meanings. If you have a line that ends with a certain word, it could also be the beginning of the next line, depending on how you break the lines up. And in doing so, what you can do is create multiple meanings for your poem, for the words, for the lines, for the themes. You can create parallels, you can create symbolism. All of those things are possible when you are very deliberate in where you break your lines up, and Crystal is really great at doing that. Another thing that she does a lot of is she writes poems in response to or reaction to also poems by other people. So there were a couple, or actually a good handful of poems that she wrote with little lines, taglines under the title, like a poem found from Amy Nez, and she had one from Thomas Salomon, one from Rose George. All of these different inspirations, different poets who are well known in the world of poetry. Sometimes she puts the name of the poem that she is responding to, other times it's just the poet. So for the ones who are just listed by name, I'm not quite sure which poem specifically she is referring to. However, I'm sure that it wouldn't be hard to find out if we, say, looked up the title or even the theme of the poem and that poet. Another thing she likes to do, just in regards to white space, I just want to go back to that for a second. Like in this poem, there are random spaces sort of in the middle of the poem, and I haven't really figured out exactly why. But I think that adds to sort of the mystery and the intrigue of the poet, of the writer, of the poem, of what it's in response to, how it affects the mood, the vibe, the themes that it's covering. This particular poem that I just showed you was titled Transformation. And so perhaps like the breaking up of the lines has to do with that as well. The next thing that I would like to talk about is poetic forms. That's something that I just recently learned about and was really delighted to learn about. I think when we think of poetry, a lot of people, of course, immediately go to Shakespeare, which, you know, is not the end-all be-all of poetry, even though that is probably a very kind of popular route that people take. But I think a lot of times in doing so, we sort of diminish the vast nature of poetry. And so in my class that I took recently, I learned about the numerous amount of poetic forms and didn't even scratch the surface, but it was interesting to learn about how these forms are used both in the past and now, and also how we can have a reference for our own work as we write poems. A lot of these forms come from Italy, from France, from Malaysia, from all over the world, and they are so beautiful. They create different feelings, different emotions with the way that they are created. I say all of that to say that Amy does use forms in her poems. Probably the one that stuck out to me the most was the one called Ketoacidosis, which, as you can see, is the most colorful poem that I have highlighted in this book. This poem is a form. I actually did email her. This was one of my questions that I emailed her. It's called a pantoum, and it has to do a lot with repetition. A pantoum is a Malaysian form, and it's just a great way to not rehash, but sort of repeat an emotion or a feeling, to sort of hone in a certain desire. Her imagery is also great. It's very gripping, very specific, and also moving. There were so many moments in which I was just sort of blown away by her word choice and her diction, and how she was able to manipulate the English language to do exactly what she wanted it to do. One sort of example that I have, not just particularly in like a specific spot of the book, but just throughout the book, is her use of verbs. She takes words that are not normally used as verbs and she makes them verbs. And what that does is not only grabs your attention as the reader, because you're thinking, oh wait, how did she just use that as a verb? That wasn't something that I expected. It also brings new meaning to what she's describing and what she's relating to the reader. I think that makes for a really great read and a much more interesting experience in poetry. So what I want to do right now is I would like to read out some of her answers for the questions that I had asked her. I really think it's important for what the poet intends to be understood. Interpretation, of course, can go a myriad of different ways, and the way that a specific reader interprets poetry is entirely up to that person. And unless it's just completely like off the chain, I don't really believe that there's a wrong way to interpret a poem, just because poetry has a way of reaching people where they are and in myriads of different situations. And so I think interpretation has a lot to do with the individual, not sort of the intent of the writer. That being said, I always love to understand certain things about the writer beforehand. And so I want to talk about some of the things that she answered for the questions that I asked her. So regarding white space, she says she likes to play around with white space. She said that it creates a blending effect, which she's exactly right. It most certainly does. And like I said before, it gives phrases different meanings, multiple meanings, and that's just so much more fun to read. As I also said before, and this is something that she also stated in her answer, she wants the poem to have multiple meanings so that people come back and read it multiple times and yet again get a different meaning each time. And that's something that I think is really considerate of the author or the poet to do, because oftentimes when you read a poem, it can be very clear cut. It's not mysterious, and those are nice as well, but it's also really great to have poetry that is mysterious and that can be read in multiple different ways by multiple different people. The subject of her reacting or responding to different poets like Amy Nez or Thomas Solman, so those were poems and poets that inspired her. She also said, and this is something that I think is important for a lot of writers, she said when she started writing, she didn't trust her own voice. She said the ability to move along poetic ideas helped her in structure and in creating or sort of expanding on themes. I think that's really an important point, because when a lot of people start writing poetry, there's obviously this feeling of like, oh, well, how do I do it? Like, where do I start? There has to be like a formulaic type of way to create a poem, and the truth is that there isn't. And so a lot of people can feel very lost, and finding your voice is something that takes a while and a lot of practice, and just sort of discovering things about yourself, about the world that you live in and how you see the world. Perspective is also really important for that, and so that can take a little bit of time and kind of building on skill. And so it's great. I think that's something that people should do. They should read a lot of poetry. That's something that I really like to impress upon people who are trying to get into writing poetry, is to read a lot of poetry, because it really does help you to see how other people express different themes that you may be also interested in expressing. It helps you find your voice by finding out what you like and what you don't like. And it also just it kind of bolsters your skill as well. It gives you like a goal for yourself to reach. In terms of taste, we all have different tastes in art, in kind of anything. And so for a lot of creators, we all have this sort of idea of where we want our talent or skill to be, but getting there is often a lifelong process. And so I think in reading poetry, there is an opportunity there to find where that place is for you to aspire to be. I also noticed, and this is not something that I talked about earlier on in the review, but I also noticed there were a lot of biblical references in her book, oftentimes maybe towards more negative connotations, although I wasn't quite sure how she had intended for those to be read. I almost describe it more as wrestling instead of negative. I think it's more wrestling with maybe biblical concepts or characters in the Bible and how they are portrayed and perceived. She specifically mentions characters like Samson, Moses, Judas, those people. And so I was really intrigued by sort of the purpose behind that, or maybe the reason behind that, because a lot of times she'll place those ancient people in more modern situations and surround maybe the story that we are more accustomed to with this more modern contemporary aesthetic, I would say. And so I had asked her about that. She writes these poems from the perspective, I think, of women, or like the experience of women who are experiencing these men. And so her reasons behind that were rewriting the stories with and giving the women more agency. For Crystal, she wanted to talk more about what the Bible excluded, and sort of maybe the characters, the women in the Bible that people forget. I think we should always reconsider the aspects of a story, or the characters, or the people who we often overlook. And I think that's a great practice in art. I think the more that we do it, it will translate into real life for people to start looking at the marginalized, the ostracized, the people that we don't see, or maybe we don't even want to see. And so doing that more in art, I think will help us practice to do it more in real life. I liked that about this book. An interesting thing that I also found out about this book, thanks to her answers, is that this collection of poetry spans about 5 years, which is a very long time, and yet I think that makes it so much better. Writing poetry is not an overnight thing. It does take years, and the poems and the poetry collections that I've loved the most are sort of labors of love, in which they take time to create, to revise, to edit, to mold into something that the author and the creator want to show the world. Oftentimes that comes with personal change, that comes with external changes that affect you. And there are some things that are hard to write about at the specific time, but maybe 5 years later you've moved on from that, and you're now able to look back with a different perspective and write more objectively about that thing, and in that way be able to connect with people who are at the moment going through whatever it is that they are experiencing. That is something that I appreciate. I appreciate things that take time. I'm a very process-oriented person, and so I always more appreciate the journey that it takes to get to somewhere rather than the actual product. And if I know that something has taken a long time, or has been a long time in the making, I am that much more supportive of it, because I think time it mellows out work. It forms things in a way that immediacy can't do. And so I really appreciate the hard work that she's put into this. So that's all I have to say for this book. There's so much more that could be said, but I don't want to spoil it all too much. I want to give you just enough to where you'll want to read her book and you'll support her work and go follow her on Instagram. I'll put her handle in the description below. But yes, go check her out. She's an awesome poet. This is her debut poetry collection, so definitely go over to her page and share some love. She'll definitely appreciate that. I hope that this has been a eye-opening review for you, and I hope that you learned something new, and I hope that this is also the start of something that I will continue to do. Also, I want to say, because this was a book in which the author reached out to me, if you guys are writing poetry, I would love to read it. I really don't have any preferences. I love the fact that people are writing, and I would love to support you in any capacity that you're doing that in, whether it's professionally, for fun, just sort of trying it out. I would love to help you with that and read your work and share it if possible. And so I just want to say that if you want me to read your poems, please send them to me. I'll put my email in the description, and also follow me on Instagram. That's another way you can contact me. Thank you so much for watching my video. I hope that you have a wonderful holiday season, and this will definitely not be the last time you see me before Christmas. Happy December, and keep reading poetry. Bye.